I see science and theology as being complementary to each other. It isn't that science answers theology's question or vice versa, but we need both sets of answers to get the fullest understanding we can get. There are two kinds of creation that theology speaks about. One is creation out of nothing, and that is the holding of the world in being. And that happens, we believe, all the time, because if God didn't hold the world in being, it would cease to exist. Then there is this unfolding process of continuous creation. And that's something that I suppose theology has only really thought about in the last, 200 years. I mean, this year we're thinking very much about Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, and very soon religious people, theologically minded people, saw the implications of evolutionary theory is exactly that the world is an unfolding creation, not a ready-made world, but it is a world whose creation is still in process. And that's a deeply satisfying, I think, and deeply illuminating way of understanding the history of the world. In Western tradition of thought, there really have been two basic metaphysical traditions. One is materialism, and the other is theism. And they differ in what they take as their unexplained brute fact. Every metaphysical scheme has to have a foundational assumption. If you're a materialist, your brute fact are the properties of matter, the laws of nature in the world. And then everything is to be explained by those. Now, I personally think that the laws of nature have a character that makes it unsatisfactory to treat them simply as a brute fact. They seem to point beyond themselves. Therefore, I prefer the alternative metaphysical tradition, which takes the will of a divine creator as its unexplained brute fact. Nobody can get away without a brute fact. When Darwin published The Origin of Species 150 years ago, there were religious people who welcomed his insights from the start. And one of them was an English clergyman called Charles Kingsley, who said that God could have made a ready-made world, but God had done something cleverer than that in producing a world in which creatures could make themselves. And that world is a greater good than I think a ready-made world would be, and it reflects the fact that God is not the sort of tyrant of the universe, but allows creatures to have freedom to be themselves and make themselves. But that process of fruitfulness, that evolutionary process of fruitfulness, will also have ragged edges and blind alleys. Genetic mutation has produced new forms of life. It also produces malignancy. You can't have one without the other. And that scientific insight has, I think, been of some help. It doesn't solve every problem, but it has been some help to theology. We all tend to think that if we had been in charge of creation, we would have done it better. We'd kept all the nice things, got rid of the nasty things. But the more science helps us to understand how the creation works, how a continuous creation has to work, the more we see that you can't tear things apart. It's a sort of package deal. And though that doesn't remove all our perplexities about evil and suffering in the world, I think it is a scientific gift to theology to have that insight. I believe that when God brought into being a temporal world, then God chose to know that world in accordance with its nature. That means to know it temporally. So though God could have seen the whole of history laid out before the divine gaze all at once, I believe that God chose to engage with time, and that God therefore journeys with time, if you like, with his temporal creation. But what I do believe is that was not imposed upon God. It wasn't that God couldn't get out of time, but that God just chose, as, if you like, solidarity with creation. I believe what the destiny that awaits us is the participating in the gradual unveiling of the infinite reality of God, inexhaustible riches of the divine nature. So the world to come is not going to be boring in a sense. It's going to be endlessly fulfilling in ways that it's impossible for us to imagine in this life. Because I think the difference between this life and the life of the world to come is that in this world, God is veiled from our sight. That's necessary if finite human beings are to be able to be themselves, to make themselves, choose for themselves. But ultimately that veil is to be withdrawn, and we are to know God more fully. And I think that's the purpose of life.